January 1998. For 5 days, eastern Canada endured wave after wave of freezing rain until homes, highways, and entire cities vanished beneath an alien crust of ice up to 100 millimeters thick. Over 1,000 steel towers collapsed. 4 million people plunged into darkness as the power grid failed. This was supposed to be impossible in modern Canada. So how did a storm bring a nation to its knees, and what happened during those endless, frozen nights? In early January 1998, a rare atmospheric alignment settled over eastern Canada. Cold Arctic air pressed down at the surface, trapped by a stubborn high over Labrador. Above it, a deep layer of warm, moist air streamed north from the Gulf of Mexico, carried by a relentless jet. This created a hidden inversion, cold below and warm above, stretching from Kingston through Montreal to the Maritimes. When snowflakes fell from the clouds, they melted into rain in the warm layer, only to become supercooled droplets in the sub-freezing air near the ground. Each drop froze instantly on contact, coating every branch, wire, and rooftop with a film of ice. But this was not a single storm. Over 5 days, from January 4th to 9th, 1998, 5 separate waves of low-pressure systems tracked along the same corridor. Each system brought a new round of freezing rain, layering fresh ice on top of what had already fallen. The weather front stalled, refusing to budge, and the cycle repeated. Rain, freeze, accumulate. In some places, the freezing rain continued for more than 80 hours. The result was a relentless, almost mechanical buildup, 1 millimeter after another, until parts of southern Quebec and eastern Ontario were entombed beneath up to 100 millimeters of solid ice. Environment Canada records show the hardest hit region, later called the Triangle of Darkness, saw more than 4 inches of ice, enough to snap century-old trees and flatten steel towers. Meteorologists would later call it the worst ice storm in Canadian history, a disaster that exceeded every known record for duration and intensity. The storm's mechanics were simple but merciless: a stalled boundary, a conveyor belt of moisture, and a cold trap that refused to let go. Each new wave only added to the weight, setting the stage for a crisis no one imagined possible. Steel towers that once stood as the backbone of Quebec's electrical grid began to fail under the growing weight. The first to go were the tall lattice pylons, designed for a fraction of the ice now encasing them. One after another, more than 1,000 of these towers buckled and twisted, dropping high voltage lines into frozen fields. Wooden utility poles fared no better. Across the region, 30,000 snapped, some sheared clean at the base, others splintered mid-span. The ground beneath became a maze of downed wires, each coated in ice as thick as a man's wrist. The destruction stretched for hundreds of kilometers. In total, 120,000 kilometers of power lines, enough to circle the Earth 3 times, were damaged or destroyed. The numbers are almost impossible to grasp. 4 million people from Montreal to Kingston lost power. Entire neighborhoods vanished into darkness. Hydro-Quebec's engineers watched their control boards as red outage lights spread across the province. On January 8th, a single remaining 735 kilovolt line kept Montreal connected to the grid. If that last corridor failed, the city would go black. Crews worked around the clock, sometimes resorting to helicopters to knock ice from the lines with swinging logs. But for every line restored, more collapsed elsewhere. The grid teetered on the edge of total failure, and the sense of urgency in control rooms was matched only by the silence settling over the cities and towns now cut off from the outside world. Montreal, Ottawa, and Kingston slipped beneath a wave of darkness. Streetlights flickered out, leaving entire neighborhoods in a cold, unbroken night. In Montreal, only a handful of windows glowed, powered by generators that hummed behind barricaded doors. The rest of the city vanished into shadow. Traffic signals failed at hundreds of intersections, turning busy boulevards into a maze of confusion. Cars crawled through makeshift four-way stops, their headlights cutting through the icy gloom. Roads blocked by fallen trees and tangled wires left some streets completely impassable, isolating whole sections of the city. Hospitals switched to emergency generators, rationing power to intensive care units and operating rooms. Diesel deliveries became a lifeline, with trucks navigating ice-choked avenues to keep the lights on for the most vulnerable. Non-urgent surgeries were postponed. In some wards, nurses worked by flashlight, conserving every watt. The silence was unsettling. The usual din of engines and voices faded, replaced by the occasional crack of ice-laden branches falling and the distant whine of a generator. For days, and in some pockets for weeks, the heart of these cities beat quietly, suspended between the ice and the silence. In the aftermath of the blackout, the true cost began to surface, not just in broken infrastructure, but in lives lost and livelihoods shattered. 35 people died as a direct result of the storm. Many of these deaths came quietly from carbon monoxide poisoning. Families, desperate for heat, turned to barbecues and generators inside their homes. Invisible fumes filled kitchens and basements, sometimes claiming entire households before help could arrive. Others succumbed to hypothermia, unable to keep warm as the temperature inside their homes dropped below freezing. In rural Quebec and Ontario, the cold was relentless. The devastation was especially acute in the so-called Triangle of Darkness south of Montreal. In Saint-Hyacinthe, the power stayed out for 23 days. For nearly a month, families rotated between neighbors' wood stoves, lined up at soup kitchens, or huddled together in municipal shelters. The storm did not just take comfort, it destroyed livelihoods. Dairy farmers watched helplessly as milking machines sat idle and herds fell sick or died. Maple syrup producers walked through forests where ice had snapped trees that were generations old, ending family businesses overnight. Across Quebec and Ontario, agricultural losses soared past $1 billion. For many, the storm's legacy was not just measured in days without power, but in futures altered beyond repair. In the heart of the blackout, the Canadian forces mobilized with a speed and scale rarely seen in peacetime. Operation Recuperation called up 15,784 troops, soldiers, reservists, and support units drawn from across the country. Their mission was clear: reach the most vulnerable wherever the ice had cut them off. Convoys rolled into towns where silence filled the streets and every window was dark. Teams moved door to door, knocking on homes buried in snowdrifts and ice, checking for signs of life. They carried lists of elderly residents, families with infants, people with medical needs. In Saint-Hyacinthe and rural Quebec, soldiers found people huddled in unheated houses, some wrapped in layers of clothing, others burning the last of their furniture for warmth. Emergency shelters sprang up in schools, arenas, and church basements. At the peak, thousands sought refuge in these makeshift havens, with troops delivering blankets, food, and reassurance. Helicopters ferried supplies to isolated farms and dropped logs onto ice-choked power lines, working alongside Hydro-Quebec crews to keep the last threads of the grid intact. For weeks, the military presence became the backbone of daily life, clearing roads, hauling debris, and offering a steady hand in a landscape transformed by ice. This was the largest peacetime deployment of the Canadian forces since 1970, a response that turned despair into a coordinated national effort. More than 250 communities were declared disaster areas in the wake of the storm, a number that speaks to the scale of disruption and the challenge of recovery. The total cost reached $5.4 billion, the highest for any natural disaster in Canadian history at that time. Yet, out of the devastation, lasting change took root. Utilities across Quebec and Ontario launched a massive rebuilding effort. Transmission towers were redesigned and rebuilt, hardened to withstand far greater ice loads than before. New emergency frameworks were written, spelling out clearer roles for local governments, utilities, and the military. Municipalities invested in backup generators, fuel reserves, and public education campaigns, urging households to prepare for at least 72 hours without outside help. These reforms were not just technical, they reflected lessons learned at kitchen tables and in crowded shelters. Stories from that winter linger. Neighbors ran extension cords between houses, sharing the hum of a single generator so that each family could keep a fridge running or a heater warm for a few hours. Strangers opened their doors to those left with nothing but cold and darkness. In community halls and church basements, volunteers cooked pots of soup and offered blankets, transforming hardship into solidarity. The storm revealed how fragile modern life could be, but also how quickly people could come together. For many, the memory is not just of ice and loss, but of kindness that cut through the cold. Today, Canada's power grid is stronger, but climate volatility rises. Extreme weather now costs Canadians billions each year. The ice may have thawed, but our vulnerability endures. What we rebuild is only as strong as our memory and our willingness to prepare for the storms ahead.